Michael Carter, a black federal prosecutor, was accustomed to working late into the night. He spent the entire day preparing files for an important case and left the office as the clock neared midnight. That night, Michael chose a quieter route home, hoping to quickly reunite with his family. Michael drove his old sedan, a car he had owned since his college days. It wasn't the kind of vehicle that reflected success, but Michael didn't care. He believed that a person's worth wasn't defined by their possessions but by their character and contributions. As Michael drove through a desolate intersection, the sudden flash of red and blue lights illuminated his rearview mirror. A patrol car was trailing him. He felt his heartbeat quicken. Taking a deep breath, Michael pulled over to the side of the road and waited. The officer stepped out, shining a blinding flashlight straight into Michael's eyes. It was Tom Miller, a patrol officer well known in the area for his tough demeanor. Miller peered through Michael's car window, his face full of suspicion. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Miller asked, his tone cold. Michael smiled politely, trying to remain calm. "I don't believe I've broken any traffic laws, officer." Miller raised an eyebrow, his expression betraying clear disdain. "Do you think you make the rules? Step out of the car now." Michael felt his face flush. There was no valid reason for the demand. However, he didn't want the situation to escalate. Michael opened the door, stepped out, and stood under the harsh glare of the patrol car's headlights. Miller moved closer, pushing Michael against the car. He wasn't asked for his name or given an explanation for the stop. Instead, Miller began to interrogate him. "Do you live around here? Don't tell me this car belongs to you." Michael replied, his tone measured. "Yes, I live a few blocks away. This car is mine as well." But Miller didn't believe him. "There's no way this is your car. Don't lie to me." As the questions continued, Michael noticed the stares of a few passers-by, curious gazes mixed with pity. Humiliation spread through him like a slow, burning flame. Michael was forced to place his hands on the hood of the car while Miller searched him. There were no explanations given, no semblance of courtesy in the officer's actions. Michael tried to conceal his anger, but deep down, he felt his dignity being trampled. "Do you have a criminal record? Or maybe you're hiding something illegal?" Miller continued, his tone heavy with suspicion. Michael clenched his teeth, his eyes locking onto Miller's cold, unyielding gaze. "I don't have a criminal record, and I'm not carrying anything illegal." It seemed Miller deliberately ignored Michael's response. After patting him down, Miller proceeded to search Michael's car without asking for permission. Michael glanced over his shoulder and saw his important file bags carelessly tossed aside, documents scattered everywhere. The taunts began to surface. "I bet you just came from somewhere shady. You don't look like someone with a respectable job." Michael felt his pride being shredded, but he managed to keep his tone steady. "I'm a federal prosecutor, officer. I just worked late and was heading home." Miller paused, momentarily taken aback. But then he laughed, as if Michael's statement was nothing more than a joke. "A prosecutor? Don't make me laugh. No prosecutor would be driving around in an old junker like this." When Miller finally handed back his documents, there was no apology, only a muttered comment about not causing trouble. Michael got back into his car, his anger and humiliation boiling within him. Back home, Michael sat quietly in the living room. He could hear his young son's laughter from the next room, and it strengthened his resolve. He didn't want his child to grow up in a world where prejudice and discrimination still thrived. Michael opened his laptop and began documenting the entire incident. He detailed everything from the moment he was pulled over, Miller's words and actions, to the emotions he experienced. Each word he typed felt like an outlet for the anger he had suppressed. The next morning, Michael arrived at the office early and met with the head of internal affairs. He submitted a formal complaint along with his detailed report. Many of his colleagues, several of whom were also black, expressed outrage and solidarity. Michael wasn't just seeking justice for himself. He wanted to shed light on the systemic injustice at play. As a prosecutor, He understood how to wield the law to effect change. And this time, he was determined to stand firm. Michael entered his office the next morning with a distinct sense of purpose. He was no longer just a prosecutor focused on high-profile criminal cases. Today, he was embarking on an investigation where he was both the victim and the initiator. His desk was prepared, laptop, detailed notes from the previous night's incident, and a thick folder containing similar cases he had compiled over the years. As colleagues passed by his office, some paused to glance at him with sympathetic looks. News of the previous night's events had spread throughout the office. One of his close colleagues, Laura Nguyen, stepped in. "Michael, I heard about what happened last night. Are you okay?" Laura asked, her voice filled with concern. Michael looked up and gave a tired smile. "Thanks, Laura. I'm fine. But this isn't just about me. This is so much bigger." Laura nodded. "Let me know if you need anything. I'll do whatever I can to help." Michael appreciated her support. He knew exposing the truth wouldn't be easy, especially when it involved the police force, an institution protected by a complex system often riddled with bias. He started with what he had, a detailed report of the incident, Miller's words, and his unlawful actions. Michael knew that to succeed, he needed more than just his account of the events. The stop had occurred near an intersection equipped with traffic cameras. This was his best chance to gather visual evidence. Michael submitted a formal request to the Department of Transportation to retrieve the footage from the previous night. Though it would take time, he knew the footage could be irrefutable evidence. A week later, when the video arrived, Michael sat at his desk and played it. The footage clearly showed his car being pulled over without any apparent reason. The patrol car's headlights glared brightly, and Miller's actions were undeniable. His approach to Michael's car, his aggressive demeanor, and his unauthorized search. Michael replayed the footage repeatedly, taking detailed notes on every violation. He knew this was a crucial piece in building a solid case. Visual evidence was critical, but Michael knew he also needed witnesses. People who had observed the incident could provide additional perspectives. He returned to the intersection that evening, hoping to find those who had been there. After some inquiries, he located Peter Johnson, a street vendor who worked near the area. Peter recalled vividly, "Yes, I saw the whole thing. I usually sell at that corner. I remember it clearly because the way that officer spoke was unacceptable. I even wondered why he was treating someone like that when they hadn't done anything wrong." Michael documented Peter's account, thanking him for his cooperation. Peter's testimony aligned perfectly with Michael's experience, further strengthening the case's credibility. Next, Michael decided to dig deeper into Tom Miller's history. He submitted a formal request to review Miller's internal complaint records. Initially, this met with resistance. The police department hesitated, delaying the release of information, but Michael persisted, emphasizing that this was part of a federal investigation. And eventually, he obtained what he needed. Miller's record was far from clean. He had been the subject of at least 5 complaints over the past 3 years, mostly involving allegations of racial discrimination and excessive use of force. Despite this, Miller had never faced serious disciplinary action. These complaints were routinely dismissed with conclusions of insufficient evidence. Michael meticulously backed up all the documents. This was the missing piece of the puzzle, a pattern of misconduct by an officer shielded by a flawed system. Michael's investigation wasn't just focused on Miller. He began to see the systemic issues, how police misconduct was often ignored or brushed aside. He reached out to colleagues in the legal field to discuss ways to approach the matter from a broader perspective. He realized this case had the potential to expose systemic injustices, but achieving that would require community support. Michael began contacting human rights organizations and the media to prepare for bringing the story to light. While Michael quietly built his case, Miller continued his duties as though nothing had happened. His arrogance blinded him to the scrutiny he was under. But Michael knew the storm was approaching. This was no longer just a personal matter. It was a fight for justice, not only for himself but for everyone who had endured injustice rooted in prejudice and discrimination. Michael placed his hand on the files in front of him, his eyes filled with determination. He knew this was just the beginning of a long battle, and he was ready to face it head-on. Tom Miller walked into the small conference room at the police department with a casual demeanor. He was used to these internal meetings, where complaints were little more than procedural formalities. Confident that the system would always shield him, Miller believed this time would be no different. What he didn't anticipate was that the person investigating the incident was Michael Carter. Michael sat on the opposite side of the table, his expression calm but his gaze sharp. He had deliberately withheld his identity in the investigation report, wanting Miller to face the questions unprepared. "We'll begin by reviewing the report from that night," Michael said, his tone composed but authoritative. Miller raised an eyebrow. He didn't immediately recognize Michael. Perhaps the glare of headlights and his own arrogance that night had obscured any details. "I followed proper protocol," Miller replied, folding his arms across his chest. "If there's an issue, I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." Michael played a short video clip from the traffic camera footage. On the screen, Miller's aggressive behavior, condescending tone, and unwarranted vehicle search were clear as day. "Can you explain why you stopped my car that night?" Michael asked, his eyes fixed on Miller's face. Miller froze, his expression shifting from nonchalance to unease. He stammered, That was you? I mean, I stopped the car because I was suspicious. That area isn't safe, and you didn't seem to fit with the car." Michael cut him off, his tone firm. "You just said, didn't fit. Do you realize how that sounds? Officer Miller, you had no evidence. Yet you chose to treat me as a criminal." Miller started to offer excuses, but Michael didn't let him off the hook. Each piece of evidence was presented with precision: witness statements, the recorded footage, and a thorough recounting of the incident. Miller's initial confidence evaporated as the weight of the evidence sank in. He realized that this time, things wouldn't be swept under the rug like before. News of Michael's case began to leak when a local journalist received a tip from someone inside the investigative office. The first article appeared on a small news outlet but quickly gained traction. The headline read, "Federal Prosecutor Becomes Victim of Racial Profiling. Police Misconduct Exposed." Michael wasn't someone who sought the spotlight, but he understood that this publicity could be a powerful advantage in challenging a biased system. Civil rights groups, both large and small, started paying attention to the case. They reached out to Michael, offering legal support and help organizing campaigns to demand justice. Not everyone supported Michael, though. Some conservative media outlets criticized him, labeling the case a political move designed to smear the police force. Reading those articles, Michael felt a mix of anger and frustration, but he reminded himself that this was part of a larger fight. At the same time, Michael began receiving threatening messages. Some came from anonymous accounts, warning him to stop before you get yourself into trouble. Michael stayed calm, forwarding all the information to his office's security team to ensure the safety of himself and his family. One morning, Michael was summoned to the office of the Director of the Federal Department of Justice. This meeting was not a friendly conversation. The director, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, regarded Michael with a look of disapproval. "Michael, I understand how you feel," the director said evenly, "but this case is causing significant division. We need to maintain the stability and image of the legal system." Michael clenched his hands under the table, trying to hide his anger. "Sir, the system can only be stable if it is fair. I cannot ignore the fact that a police officer abused his power in such a manner." The director sighed, shaking his head. "We can handle this internally. I strongly suggest you reconsider, and not let this escalate further." Michael understood the true meaning behind those words. Drop it. But he wasn't willing to back down. Rising from his seat, he looked the director in the eye. "With all due respect, sir, I will continue to pursue this case." Justice cannot be compromised. As Michael left the office, he felt both pride and apprehension. He knew he had taken a stand against a powerful system and that those at the top were not always supportive of change. But he also knew there was no turning back. Michael knew that to bring this story to light, he needed to face the public directly. He decided to hold a press conference where he would recount the entire incident and reaffirm his commitment to fighting for justice. That day, the conference room was packed with journalists, cameras, microphones, and lights focused on Michael as he stepped up to the podium. Clad in a sharp suit, he exuded confidence and determination. He began his speech in a calm but powerful voice. "I am not just a federal prosecutor. I am a husband, a father, and most importantly, a citizen of this country. What happened to me that night was not an isolated incident. It is a testament to a larger issue we must confront: the injustice and prejudice embedded in our legal system." Michael recounted the incident in vivid detail, leaving nothing out. He spoke of the humiliation of being treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin and the fear of raising his family in a world where injustice was a persistent reality. When Michael finished his speech, the room fell silent. Then came the applause, tentative at first, then building into a strong and unified response. Journalists swarmed him with questions, and Michael answered with clarity and candor. The following day, articles, video clips, and photos from the press conference flooded social media and mainstream news outlets. Michael became a symbol of the fight against racial profiling in the justice system, a voice that many had long awaited. But with this newfound visibility, Michael also understood that his greatest challenges were only beginning. In the days following the press conference, Michael realized that his life and that of his family had changed completely. The media, both supportive and critical, could not stop mentioning his name. Praises for Michael's courage flooded newspapers and social media. But so did malicious articles from conservative and extremist circles. Michael's once peaceful home became the center of attention. Journalists camped outside, hoping for an exclusive quote or photo. His wife, Angela, tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for their young son. But the worry on her face was unmistakable every time there was a knock at the door or the phone rang. Michael began receiving anonymous letters, some of them containing frightening threats. One read, "If you keep this up, your family won't be safe." Michael remained calm, reporting everything to his office's security team and increasing protective measures for his family. Late one night, as Michael was working in his home office, a brick smashed through the window, shattering the glass. Angela screamed from the living room, and Michael rushed outside, only to catch a glimpse of a stranger disappearing into the darkness. Michael understood the price of standing up against a biased system, but he hadn't anticipated the cruelty it would entail. Still, he was undeterred. If anything, these events only strengthened his resolve. As Michael prepared for the legal battle, Tom Miller and his allies within the police department began to take action. Miller felt the pressure mounting as his name appeared everywhere, associated with terms like racism and misconduct. His usual arrogance was replaced with a growing sense of fear. One morning, Miller met with a few close colleagues at a cafe near the police station. His voice was low, but it carried a sharp edge of anger. "We can't let him win. If this gets out of hand, it's not just me. Our entire system will be dragged through the mud. We have to do something." One of his colleagues, an officer named Rick, nodded in agreement. "Exactly. We need to discredit him, just enough to make people doubt him." A plan to smear Michael began to take shape. Miller and Rick secretly fabricated a false report, accusing Michael of accepting bribes in a past case. They gathered unrelated snippets from old news articles and twisted them into a completely false narrative. Then, they anonymously sent this fabricated story to a tabloid journalist. Within a day, the story spread online under the headline, "Crusader for Justice or Corrupt Prosecutor?" Michael saw the article the next morning. It hit him like a punch to the gut. The baseless accusations were written ambiguously. but they were enough to sow seeds of doubt. Michael knew this was no coincidence. He had become the target of a deliberate attack. Determined not to let the lies fester, Michael knew he had to act swiftly. Michael held an emergency meeting with his legal team. He instructed them to investigate the origins of the article and uncover who was behind the accusations. Within days, Michael's team discovered that the story had been sourced from an anonymous account linked to the internal ranks of the police department. Unwilling to let this stand, Michael arranged for a live television interview where he publicly denied the allegations and presented evidence proving his innocence. Speaking firmly, he declared, "These accusations are not just aimed at me. They target the fight against injustice. I will not let this deter me from standing for what is right." Meanwhile, tensions continued to escalate. One night, as Michael was leaving his office, a suspicious car began tailing him. Staying calm, Michael drove through several streets to test if he was being followed. When the vehicle drew closer, he saw it was a black SUV with its license plate obscured. Suddenly, the SUV accelerated and attempted to force Michael's car off the road. He managed to brake just in time, avoiding a crash, but the sense of danger lingered. When Michael reported the incident, the police claimed they couldn't find any evidence of the vehicle. Michael understood he was being watched, but instead of intimidating him, it only fueled his resolve to press forward. The case was officially brought to court. Michael represented himself, supported by his legal team. He knew this was his opportunity not only to expose Miller's misconduct, but also to highlight the larger systemic issues within the justice system. The first hearing took place in a tense atmosphere. Miller and his attorney argued that he was simply following procedure and had no intention of discrimination. But Michael was well prepared. He presented the traffic camera footage, eyewitness testimony, and Miller's internal records. A memorable moment in the trial came when Michael cross-examined Miller. "Officer Miller, did you stop any other vehicles at that intersection on the night in question?" Miller hesitated before responding. "No." Michael pressed further. "Then why did you stop my car?" "I wasn't speeding. I didn't run a red light." "What was the only reason?" Miller remained silent, his inability to answer resonating throughout the courtroom. Outside the courthouse, the community followed every step of the case. Civil rights groups organized peaceful protests, holding signs with messages like "Justice for all" and "End racial profiling." After multiple intense hearings, the evidence and witness testimonies revealed the truth. The court ruled that Miller's actions constituted a severe abuse of power and a violation of human rights. Not only was Miller held accountable, but his police department was also ordered to implement reforms. As the verdict was read, Michael felt a heavy weight lift from his shoulders. He knew the fight wasn't over, but this was a significant step toward justice. On his way home, Michael saw his son standing at the front door. Waving to him, he smiled, feeling a renewed sense of hope, not just for his family but for future generations as well. The trial concluded, but its impact continued to resonate across the public sphere. Michael had not only won a personal case but had also sparked a national conversation about racial profiling and systemic bias in the justice system. The media kept the story alive, pressuring authorities to implement meaningful changes. But Michael knew justice was not just about a single verdict. It was about long-term change in how society treated people like him. Human rights organizations began reaching out to Michael for collaboration. One of the first invitations came from the Civil Justice Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting for equality. They invited Michael to become a spokesperson for a campaign to raise awareness about racial discrimination. Michael agreed, but on one condition: he wouldn't just be a symbol. He wanted to contribute meaningfully to systemic reform. Together with the organization's team, Michael began researching new policies to reduce abuses of power within law enforcement. At a conference, Michael met Dr. Evelyn Ross, a renowned sociologist known for her research on racial inequality. Evelyn had spent years collecting data and analyzing how unconscious bias influenced human behavior, particularly within law enforcement. Their conversation lasted for hours and led to the idea of creating a mandatory training program for police officers, focusing on eliminating racial bias in their conduct. This partnership marked a new chapter in Michael's journey, as he moved beyond personal justice to work toward a future where such injustices would no longer persist. While Michael focused on his reform work, the community continued to rally around him with unwavering support. Peaceful protests, social media posts, and petition campaigns highlighted the critical need for systemic change. One day, Michael was invited to an event organized by the local community. Held in a small park, the gathering drew hundreds of people eager to hear him speak. As Michael stepped onto the stage, his heart swelled with emotion. The crowd was a tapestry of diversity, young and old, black and white, all sharing the same hopeful gaze. Michael spoke about his journey, not just as a prosecutor but as a human being who had endured injustice. He emphasized that his story was not just about one individual but represented the millions who had faced discrimination because of their race, religion, or gender. As his speech concluded, an elderly man approached Michael. Grasping Michael's hand with trembling fingers, he said, "Thank you. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for all of us." Michael looked at the man, realizing that his work had become far more meaningful than he had ever imagined. As Michael moved forward, Tom Miller's life spiraled into chaos. He was suspended from duty immediately after the verdict, and the colleagues who once defended him now kept their distance. Under pressure from both the media and the community, Miller became the target of widespread criticism and outrage. One evening, in his small home, Miller sat at his empty dining table, staring at a medal he had once received for outstanding service. He thought back to his early days in the police force, when he had been a young, idealistic recruit full of passion and purpose. But over time, bitterness and unconscious biases had crept into his mind, transforming him into someone he barely recognized. Miller wasn't entirely a bad person. He was a product of a system that had fostered injustice. Yet now, as he faced the consequences of his actions, Miller couldn't help but wonder, if he had the chance to start over, would things have been different? Seeking redemption, Miller reached out to a counselor who helped him confront the deep-seated issues in his worldview. Slowly, he began the long process of self-reflection and change. Though it came late, Miller took his first step toward making amends. He wrote a public letter of apology to Michael, admitting his faults and expressing the hope that one day, he might find a way to make up for his wrongs. When Michael read Miller's apology letter, he wasn't sure how to feel. Part of him wanted to forgive, but another part still harbored anger. Ultimately, he decided to use the letter as an opportunity to spark a conversation about change. Michael included the letter in a speech he gave at a national conference on judicial reform. He said, "This letter shows that even those who have made mistakes can recognize the problem. But recognition alone is not enough. We must change the system so that no one has to write letters like this ever again." Working alongside lawmakers, Michael pushed for new legislation. One of his greatest achievements was the implementation of a mandatory racial bias training program for all police officers nationwide. The program not only focused on legal standards, but also emphasized building empathy and understanding between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Additionally, Michael advocated for the creation of an independent oversight agency to investigate complaints of police misconduct. This agency would ensure that officers like Miller could not escape accountability through internal protections. These changes did not happen overnight, and Michael knew his work was far from over. Yet, as he reflected, he felt proud of the progress he and the community had achieved. On a quiet evening, sitting with his wife and son, Michael smiled. He knew his son would grow up in a better world, one where justice was not just a dream but a reality they had fought to make possible. Tom Miller stood before the court in another trial, this time facing charges for his misconduct throughout his career as a police officer. Those who had previously filed complaints against Miller, including Michael, came forward to testify and reveal the truth. Evidence from internal records and witness statements painted a clear picture of an officer who had not only violated human rights, but also abused his power to perpetuate bias. Miller no longer bore the arrogance of his past. He looked gaunt, his eyes weary as he listened to each accusation. The colleagues who once stood by him no longer defended him. Quietly, they admitted that the system had protected Miller for far too long, and his downfall was inevitable. The court sentenced Miller to penalties that went beyond stripping him of his badge and pension. He was also held legally accountable for his actions. While the sentence was not overly severe, it sent a clear message. The system was beginning to change, and misconduct would no longer be tolerated. As the trial concluded, Michael stepped outside, surrounded by a crowd of reporters. He spoke briefly. "This is not my victory. This is a victory for justice." After the final trial, Michael spent more time with his family. His life, previously consumed by the pressures of work and the legal battle, now shifted to making up for lost moments with his wife and son. One evening, the whole family went for a walk in the park near their home. Michael's young son ran around, his laughter echoing through the peaceful air. Angela, Michael's wife, looked at him and said, "I'm proud of you, Michael, not just for what you've done for the community, but because you stayed true to your values." Michael held Angela's hand, feeling the warmth and support of his life partner. He knew that without her encouragement and bravery, he couldn't have come this far. Family dinners became sacred moments, where Michael could share in and listen to the small stories of his son's day. One evening, as they all sat on the couch watching a movie, his son suddenly asked, "Dad, when will I get to do something big like you?" Michael smiled, pulling his son into a hug. "You don't have to do something big to be a good person. As long as you live fairly and stand up for what's right, you'll make a difference." As the reform policies began to take effect, the community felt the changes. Police forces underwent retraining. Racial bias education programs were implemented, and independent oversight agencies started investigating cases that had previously been ignored. Michael received letters from across the country, many from people thanking him for standing up. One letter, in particular, came from a young woman named Sarah, who shared that she had been a victim of discrimination in a similar incident. She wrote, "Because of you, I feel hope. You've proven that justice can prevail, even when it takes the hardest path." Michael read the letter, his eyes glistening with tears. He realized that his story had not only changed his own life, but had also given hope to others who had faced similar struggles. Meanwhile, the first reports on the impact of the reforms were released. Complaints of police misconduct had dropped significantly, and relationships between law enforcement and communities were starting to improve. Michael was invited to appear on a major television program, where he was honored as someone who had contributed to societal change. When the host asked him, "What do you think is the most important factor in achieving justice?" Michael responded, "Justice is not a destination. It's a journey we must walk together." Continuously, years passed, and Michael continued his work. But he was no longer just a prosecutor. He had become an activist, a speaker, and a symbol of justice. Traveling across the country, he shared his story and championed change. One day, Michael received an invitation to speak at a university before a class of law students. As he entered the lecture hall, hundreds of students waited eagerly to hear him. Looking at their young, hopeful faces, Michael was reminded of his own early days in the legal field, filled with ambition and purpose. Michael told them, "You are the next generation. You will face the challenges that my generation and others have encountered. But I believe you will do better than us because you have the power not just to change the law but to change hearts." When the speech concluded, a student approached Michael and said, "Sir, your story has inspired me. I want to become a prosecutor like you, to protect those who have no voice." Michael smiled, his heart filled with hope. He knew that his work had sparked a wave of change, and now that wave was being carried forward by the younger generation. That evening, as Michael returned home, He sat at his desk, looking at photos of his family and colleagues. He reflected on his journey, from a victim of injustice to a force for change. Michael didn't know what the future would hold, but he was certain of one thing: he had lived a meaningful life. Under the glow of his desk lamp, he began writing his book, recounting his journey not to glorify himself, but to inspire those who needed it. Michael's story didn't end here, continued, not just through his life but in every step taken toward a more just and equitable society.